very much, Shirley. I was thinking especially of Sweet Hour of Prayer. That particular song is just an impressive thing. A man who was, I believe, blind writing that. Just a beautiful thought, Sweet Hour of Prayer. We would always go to that time of prayer with the Lord. Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Shirley. Take and turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 8. I don't know if you noticed when we sang To God Be the Glory on the previous page, something I noticed the last time we sang it. Blessed Assurance, for whatever reason, when they put the hymnal together, they decided, instead of calling the woman Phoebe, which is what her name was, they call her Mrs. Joseph Knapp. And that was her husband's name, and it was kind of odd, because Fanny Crosby, they didn't put her husband's name. But it was just kind of a funny thing, and I'm not sure why. I don't know, I guess the reason I even say anything is because it aggravated me. Why not just give her name? I mean, she wrote the song, not her husband, and why she was a good friend of Fanny Crosby's. Why not give her the credit that's due to her for what she did? Anyway, just something I noticed as we were singing that. I remember thinking that the last time we sang it. Luke chapter 8. Jesus, beginning in verse 22, this is a series. We're actually going to go all the way through verse 56. And don't worry, we're not going to every little piece of it. But it is amazing, a string of 4 miracles that Jesus performs. And Luke gives them one right after the other. And I think there's a real important reason why he does that. Beginning in verse 22, he starts by saying, Luke, as he writes, "Now it came to pass on a certain day that he went into a ship with his disciples. And he said unto them, Let us go over unto the other side of the lake. And they launched forth. And as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm of wind on the lake." Some suggest this is a hurricane-type force winds. And they were filled with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we perish. Then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging water, and they ceased and were as calm. And he said unto them, Where is your faith? And they, being afraid, wondered, saying to another, What manner of man is this? For he commandeth even the winds and water, and they obey him. Let's pray. Father, how we thank you for your word, and we ask that you might take your word this morning, and you might use it in a way that brings you honor and glory, and may each of us realize our position before you. May we respond to you in a way that brings you honor and glory. In Jesus' name, amen. When you look through the beginning of this particular story, I'm reminded in some respect, for those of you who know the history here of the church, I was greatly blessed listening to, several months ago, listening to several of the people who were part of founding this church. It was an interesting theme that each person was talking about, and it was faith. That everything seemed to be done by faith. When things were needed, people prayed, and God gave pews, and gave furniture, and gave buildings, and gave paint, and gave everything as this church was being built. And it's interesting because I think, and sometimes when we get to a place, and we kind of somewhat with this with the disciples here, beginning of verse 22, sometimes we can get to a place where we think we know how everything is going to turn out, and we really don't have to exercise faith anymore. There's a place where we just kind of expect things to go as they have. We've watched the way things have gone, and we get comfortable. And honestly, when the Lord does things like He's about to do in these 4 cases, so many times we respond to Him by saying, this wasn't supposed to happen. And I think He responds with the question, and the title I put here to the message, where's your faith? Because if you look through these passages, the only person, in fact, the key words I put down here, that I put in quotations, commanded is the first one. That you're going to see this. In fact, in the passage we read, you see this, and it actually comes up again when He heals the man, the demoniac of Gadara. When He heals him, that same word is actually used by people. The word faith is the second one in. And this one's used in almost every case. In fact, it's used in the first one, and it's used in the second one, which is kind of embedded in what we see in the fourth one. The idea of being saved. That's another key word you'll see. You'll see it actually in the last two miracles that he works here in going through verse 56. You'll see this word reporting, and it's kind of an interesting one because you'll find that people are reporting things. Specifically, one of the people who reports things is the woman that's mentioned, who's kind of embedded as another part of the story. And the last word I have here among the five is having faith. There's a verb actually for faith that is used for Jairus in what God tells him and what Jesus actually says to him. So these words, and there could be other ones you could put in here, but words that jumped out to me were the word commanded, the word faith, the word save, the word reporting, and the word having faith. Seems like he's hammering at something in all of these instances where where Jesus does something and there's a purpose behind it and what he elicits in the people that he performs these miracles for. When you begin in verse 22, this is kind of an interesting thing because if you go into Mark and you go into Matthew, they'll tell you the same story. They're all going to tell you this story about him getting out there with his disciples. It is interesting because Matthew is going to tell one idea that Luke doesn't bring up, and Mark is going to tell us something else that they add to what they say to Jesus from what Luke says has them recorded saying him. When you put Mark's gospel with this, it seems like Jesus has been spending an entire day preaching. Probably the events that even in Luke's gospel that come right before this, it's very possible that Jesus has been preaching all day. If you've ever done anything, any kind of job that you do, if you've been doing it all day, what do most of us do at the end of that day? Especially if it's been a hard day. If you can imagine a person like Jesus, he's been up all day and he's been preaching and he's been healing and he's been doing a whole bunch of stuff. And he is man and he's also God. Jesus, as nightfall is coming, evidently, and this is what most people believe, that this is at nighttime, that Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, let's go out, we need to go somewhere. So let's get in the boat and let's leave. Now put yourself in the position of the disciples. You haven't really been doing a whole lot. You've been watching Jesus, you've been listening to him preach, you've been asking him questions. He's been doing all of the work, and he asked you to go out on the sea. Now, it's possible, we know pretty definite that at least 5, if not 6 of his disciples are fishermen. It's possible if you throw Thomas in there, if he was, you got 7 men who've been out on a sea, who've been out in this lake, who have actually seen what happens. And as I understand, the Sea of Galilee, even today, if you go on it, you will find out that it has winds that whip up very, very quickly. But these disciples would have been part of that. They would have seen some of this. And these guys knew what to do on the sea. This was their job. They were in their element. And the passage tells us that Jesus, once they leave, Jesus goes down and he lays down for a nap. He's tired. It's been a long day. And he goes to sleep. And the amazing thing to us is that as this happens, a hurricane type of wind. I mean, that's the impression you've got to get. This was just awful. This was terrible. This was the kind of wind, I mean, if you think about it from that standpoint, none of us would want to be out in the ocean in a hurricane. And that's this kind of wind that's hitting this boat. And I can imagine for just a moment that the disciples, fishermen, we can take care of this. We got this. And they start trying. And they don't get anywhere. Despite their best efforts, despite the fact that these guys know what they're doing, their best efforts don't do anything. And the whole time, Jesus is still asleep in the boat. Now, if you're a heavy sleeper, maybe you can empathize with this. If you've ever had storms come up, there have been times when the kids and Christy have mentioned something about a storm, and I've gone, we had a storm last night? I didn't know. Didn't even hear it. Wind was whipping against the house. It was strong, but I didn't hear anything. In some respect, that's kind of the way Jesus is at this point in time. Jesus is sitting there with hurricane-force winds, and he sleeps through it. So in some respect, you can understand exactly where the disciples are when they approach Jesus after this. And they look like, in fact, verse 23 says, the boat is filling with water, and they are going to die. It is a guarantee that if nothing changes, that if the events continue, they're going to die, and they know they're going to die. And they go to Jesus, and they don't go, oh, Master. They're panicked. They have to be. Master! Master! It's kind of interesting because the word they use for him, only Luke uses this word to describe Jesus. He's going to do it twice before the end of this chapter. He's going to do it twice in chapter 9. He's going to do it in chapter 17. He's going to use this word to describe the Lord as master, commander, ruler, authority. He doesn't use the word just Lord. He's not just using the word teacher. He's using a word that describes Jesus as the authority. And they recognized him as an authority, and they said, and it's interesting because if you read the other Gospels, you get a fuller picture of exactly what they say. Here, all they say is, we perish. We're doomed. That we're going down with the ship. In Matthew and Mark, if you put them together, Mark has them saying, in addition to this, say, don't you care? Don't you care? We're going to die and you are asleep. Why are you still asleep? Don't you care about us? And Matthew adds this one little phrase, save us. They are so panic-stricken. Can you imagine what it would have been like for the Lord to have woken up? He had to know what was going on. He's the God of all the universe. It's not like he went, it's kind of odd. I didn't know this was happening. Well, if you'd have woken me up a little earlier, if I'd known this was going to happen, I would have stayed awake. No, that's not the way Jesus is. Jesus knows everything. He is God. He wakes up, and the first thing he decides to do, and this is the amazing thing, he gets up, he rebukes the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. Some have suggested that this may very well have been the devil trying to get him. That the devil, in his best plans, was using nature to the best of his ability to sink the boat and kill the Son of God. I don't know. The passage doesn't say that. But there are plenty of people who believe that that's what's going on here. That nature is rebelling against its creator who's in the boat because the devil is behind it. Either way, was Jesus going to drown in the boat that day? And the answer is no. No way that was going to happen. Here are these guys who've been out with him for all of this length of time, and Jesus is looking at these guys and he is saying to them, why would you not realize this? First, he doesn't do that. He takes care of what they need. He rebukes. He tells basically the wind and the waves to knock it off now. And the passage tells us as soon as he says that, the wind stops immediately. And the water that has been drenching their boat goes calm as glass. And that's when he looks at the disciples and says, where is your faith? Where was their faith? I mean, in this first miracle, the storm is calmed. Where was their faith? I wonder if their faith wasn't in their abilities to get out of this. Their faith wasn't in something else was going to happen. But for a while, they had no faith that the Son of God could stop this. It may be because they weren't entirely sure, maybe at this point, exactly who Jesus was. They'd been with him a while. They believed him to be the Messiah, the Son of God, but they really weren't sure. They weren't completely confirmed. In fact, after Jesus asked them this question, they are all afraid. And the response that they have is that the disciples ask this question, what manner of man is this, for he commandeth even the winds and the water, and they obey him? The disciples ask, who is Jesus? Now that's a question for all of us, isn't it? Because think about this for a second. Here is all the forces of nature against this little boat and these 12 men. and they're scared to death, and 7 of them know exactly what they should be doing, and nothing has worked, and they're scared to death, and Jesus simply walks up, stands up, rebukes the wind and the waves, and they obey Him immediately. Kind of interesting, isn't it, by the way? The winds and the waves obey Him immediately. How often do we obey Him immediately? And it's kind of interesting that nature responds far better than we do to the God of the universe. Someone put it like this. It's kind of an interesting thought. We have people talk about Mother Nature, and let's just for a moment take that image and let's run with it. If you look at this passage, it means this. Mother Nature, even, quote unquote, she submits to the God of all the universe. Guess what? If He says, knock it off, stop, even nature goes, okay, we're done. Even they obey Him. You ever been in a storm in the basement, just hoping that your house didn't fall in on you? Scared to death? When I was a kid, there was a tornado that passed through the town where I lived, not far from our house, I don't think. It actually took and shook the foundation on the neighbor's house. For years, I remember you could see a little bit of a gap between part of their house on this one side. And it actually took my parents, we called it a carport. I think most people call it a lean-to. It was attached to the house. They put the car in it. And this particular day, my dad had just gotten home from work, hadn't parked in the garage or anything, in that carport. But it took and knocked the bricks out of it, and he actually had to have it replaced. Picked the car up and spun it around. And I remember ever since then, I haven't been particularly fond or calm during things when you hear tornado. It's kind of interesting because Ashlyn, I guess, carries on the tradition that my sister and I have in that respect, where when a tornado comes up, do you go, oh, well, the Lord's in control? Or do you go, oh, no, we could die? Well, yeah, you could die. But isn't it great encouragement to know that no matter what, the God of all the universe is still in control, even of nature? And His disciples were worried, we're going to die. And He says, no, I control nature. The very next story that runs us all the way from verse 26 down to verse 39, 13 verses, where He goes across the lake. And it says to us in verse 26 that it's over against Galilee. So they go completely to the other side. Now what has to help us here is that they're going into completely Gentile territory. The Jews didn't typically go out there. It wasn't a place where Jews would make their homes. In fact, there's a reason why. We're told that there's a man who meets Him there, and the man who meets Him there is in the tombs, which apparently were close by. So it's not exactly a place where the Jews would want to set up shop and run a business. So more than likely, these people are Gentiles. There were Jews in that general area, but it's possible that the people He's speaking to at this point in time are Gentiles. Completely and thoroughly Gentiles. When Jesus lands, and I had not thought of it like this, but it's possible, if He did this at night, going across the sea, it's also possible that when He gets there, it's late at night. Now, how many of you would like to go tromping through a cemetery late at night? I mean, we can think there are no ghosts, but how many of us really want to go, ooh, let's go through a graveyard at night? That would be cool. I'm not one of those people. I mean, I'm not a person who would, if it's a horror movie, don't want to see it. Don't care to, have no interest in it. Don't want to read anything like that. Here, they show up on the shore in front of the tombs after the horrible night they've just had on the sea, just about sunk their boat, and they get to the other side, and there's a man who comes running at them. Crazy. One of the Gospels tells us there's 2 men. We know at least that there's one. Luke tells us only of one being there, out among the tombs. Not exactly the kind of thing. In fact, I've heard some people who have actually made the landing on that side of the shore late at night and said it's a spooky kind of thing when you show up on the shore. With that in mind, with no spotlights, with no electricity, when you land on the beach, what do you think has probably got to be going through the disciples' head when all of a sudden there's a man, we're told in verse 27, who has a devil in him for a long time. He didn't wear any clothes. There's a naked man running up to you, and he looks crazy. Now, what would you think to do? I know what I would be thinking to do. Let's get back in the boat now. Jesus doesn't. Jesus looks at the man, and it's kind of interesting, by the way, he couldn't even stay in a home. In fact, there's several things that are said to him in verse 29. This guy was so bad, the spirit that was in him, the number of them we're not even sure. They had caught him, they had bound him, and he could break the chains and the fetters. He could break what they put him in, the shackles on his feet, the handcuffs basically on his hands, and he could break them apart. That's a very strong man. And the devil would take him out into the wilderness. Not exactly the kind of guy I would stand there and wait on. I can honestly probably say if I was one of Jesus' disciples and I saw the man running at me, the first thought I'm thinking of, get the boat ready now. We're going back across the sea. Jesus looks at the man, and the man actually says this to him, "What have I to do with thee?" What's our relationship, Jesus, thou Son of God Most High? "I beseech thee, torment me not." It's interesting. He looks at him and says, "Don't torment me." Which means the demon here knows, this legion of demons, how many ever there are, they know who he is. And they call him the Son of God. Very similar to what's said in Capernaum when he goes into the synagogue and the demon-possessed man comes in there. He turns and looks at Jesus and calls him the Holy One of God. Here he calls him the Son of the Most High. What are you doing here? Which means, I know I'm in trouble. I know there's no way I'm going to change this. What are you doing here? Jesus asked him his name, and the reason that we're told is because Jesus had been talking to this man, talking to the demons to get them out of this man. Now, at first it might sound like, well, Jesus doesn't have the power to do anything. And that's not what's going on here. Jesus looks at this man, asks him his name, and he's told Legion. By the way, some think, and I think this is kind of goofy, they think that really it was just a mental disease that he had, and the reason that he had it is because he had suffered something at the hands of the Roman legions. That's pure supposition. I mean, you can't prove that from the text. I think it was a lot of them, and they just were a lot of them. Some would suggest a legion, by the way, is 6,000 soldiers. So there's that potential that he's got 6,000 demons afflicting him at this point in time. Either way, Jesus asks him his name. He tells him his name. And that's kind of interesting because look in verse 31. They besought him that he would not command them to go out and into the deep. The idea is not to go to the abyss. If you read the book of Revelation, you know that's where they're going. The demon knows that's where he's headed. That he knows that's his ultimate end. And he's saying, please don't send me there yet. This is interesting. Because the next thing, they look around, verse 33, and actually what they ask is, in verse 32, they see that there is a sufficient, that seems to be the idea, there's a sufficient feeding of pigs on the hillside. It's kind of interesting, got your pigs out close to the tombs, at middle of the night. Not exactly the thing I would want to be doing. I think I might have taken a different job. But here, probably a Gentile is out there, and they watch the unfolding of these events when they ask to go into the swine. And, verse 33, the devils go out, and the whole herd of pigs, they run violently toward a steep place and into the lake, and were choked. Now, the point we have to make here is Jesus, all he did was gave them permission. He didn't kill the pigs. The demons did. That was the reaction the pigs had to Jesus' permission. But Jesus, and I think the demon knew this, the demons, they knew that when he said something, it was all but done. If he had said, no, you're going to the abyss, they know they had to obey. They had no option. Kind of interesting because a lot of people are curious, why did he even listen to the demons? Honestly, I don't know. But I do know this. He cast these legion of demons out of this man. And the response of the people is really the saddest part. If you think for a minute, if you had watched this, what do you think you would do? If you had just watched a man's entire herd of pigs go run violently into the water, and the second thing is to watch the man and the reaction and the change in the man, what do you think you would do? Well, we're told when they see what's done, And they that fed them, verse 34, they go into the city, they run into the city, and they told everybody exactly what had happened. In the process, all the people in the town, in verse 35, they run out, and they see this guy that they couldn't put anything on, and they could not handle. It says here, they find this man clothed and in his right mind. He is completely lucid. He's completely calm. This guy is a completely different person. And people told them exactly what had happened in verse 36. Sad part, verse 37. The whole multitude of the country of the Gadarenes round about besought him. They begged him, like the man's about to do this to them. They begged him to depart from them, for they were taken in great fear. And they get back in the ship, and they're going to leave. You know, think about this for just a moment. What do you think you would do if the great God of all the universe had just taken a guy who had been a problem? Sure, there are a whole bunch of pigs who die in the process. But what did you care most about? They were scared about what happened to the pigs. They weren't rejoicing about what happened to the man. The guy you couldn't control is now sitting there at the feet of Jesus, calm and with clothes on. And he had none of those before this. If you think about this for a second, how do people typically react when they see a person who is a fall-down drunk get saved and be a completely different person? What do people do when they see a guy who's been in prison, who was a murderer, and he gets saved? What do people think about that? Most people go, well, I don't want that. These folks didn't want Jesus, despite the fact what he had done. He had just changed radically their entire problem. And they want him to leave, except for the man. Verse 38. The people say, leave us. But the man asks, think about this for a second. The guy begs Jesus that he might go with him. And Jesus sends him away. This is kind of an interesting thought. Jesus could have said, hey, we got room for him in the boat. Let's take him back over. I can show him off to other people in Galilee, tell him about his story, and let this guy be kind of like a sideshow attraction. He can be the sideshow attraction to my ministry, and people can look at him and say, he must be the Son of God because look what he did for this guy. Jesus refuses that and then tells him in verse 39, return to thine own house and show. That word for to show is the idea of describe how great things God has done unto thee. And the guy goes his way. And sure enough, he publishes, he reports throughout the whole city what Jesus, this is the interesting thing, he said, go tell what God's done for you. And what does he do? He goes and tells everybody what Jesus did for him. Which means what? I think this guy realized Jesus was God. That's the only option he had. He went to tell them what Jesus had done for him. And he said, go tell them what God's done for you. Now, on some level, folks, isn't that the way we should all be? To be honest. Shouldn't we all, like this man, want to go out and tell and describe for people what God's done for us? And how often does God take us, vile sinners that we are, self-righteous people that we are, save us, and we choose to tell no one? We sit back and allow God to maybe do something in somebody else's life. Here was a guy who didn't have to be told twice to go tell everybody what God had done for him, what Jesus had done for him. The sad part for all of us is that we have to be prodded, pricked, humiliated, put a guilt trip on us, threatened, before we might go tell people what Jesus has done for us. For us, it takes a lot to push us. We've got to be assured success to tell everybody just what he did for us. And here was this man, didn't have to take anything else in order to do that. The third story that's told, they go back across the lake. Verse 40 picks up the story. And Jesus, when he gets back, there's a group of people waiting for him. There's a guy named Jairus. He was the leader of the synagogue. And he comes to Jesus' feet and he begs him for help. And the reason, he had a 12-year-old daughter, in verse 42, and she was dying. Now, your only child laying on their deathbed, you're desperate. And this guy flocks to Jesus and asks him to come. And sure enough, Jesus, when he hears this, goes with him. Now, we're told that there's such a massive crowd, and there's a woman among that crowd who for 12 years has had a problem. Now, we're not entirely sure. Some idea that this woman has had a hemorrhage in some respect. What exactly that means, we're not entirely sure what the ailment is. But we know this. It's of such a degree that everyone knows it, and she's probably unclean. Now, here's a woman who has nothing when anybody's going to come near her and touch her or do anything. She's in the crowd and she sees Jesus, and she has an idea. You know, if I can just touch him, maybe, just maybe, I'll be healed. I think that's all I need. And she's not looking for public acclaim. She's not looking for people to notice her. And in this kind of a crowd where everybody is pushing in, just crushing in, and probably the disciples are like, knock it off. Can you people back up? If you've ever been in a large crowd, you've probably felt that, right? Where you can't move, and you're like, well, please, someone just move. There's this massive crowd around him, and this woman gets in the crowd, and we're told that she gets the tassel. On Jews, they would have had tassels at the hems of their garments, and it would have demonstrated, this is kind of the interesting part, it would have demonstrated their purity, their cleanness. And it's that an unclean woman touches. Now, you're getting pushed, you're getting prodded, and this woman reaches up and touches him, and sure enough, she's healed. And Jesus stops and looks at his disciples and says, who touched me? Peter, the guy who's always ready for an answer, goes, Lord, basically, are you seeing this? You're asking who touched you. We're not going to be able to do that. There's no way we can figure out. Who hasn't been touching you? We're being pushed. And you ask the question, who's touched you? And Jesus isn't going to let up, and he says, no. And exactly what this means, power has gone out from me. Again, we're not entirely sure what he's hinting at here. At the very least, obviously the sovereign of all the universe knew someone had touched him, and he knew that someone had been made healed. Now, I got a feeling Jesus knew exactly what it was. He's not asking this question so that he can go, I need to have the answer to that question. He knows what woman has done this. He's asking for her sake. And probably the disciples as well. Because this woman believed this, and it's possible that she's already on her way out. And if you look at this passage, when the woman thinks that she's been able to do this in secret, finally when Jesus won't let up, and Jesus is not going to let the issue die, and he's going to stop, and the person who touched him is going to come forward. In fact, it's interesting because it seems like a lot of people around him are denying it. No, we didn't do it. And finally, we're told that the woman in verse 47, she saw that she was not hid. She couldn't keep this a secret. Now, what's interesting is she could keep it a secret from everyone else in the crowd. Who knew that she touched him? The people right next to him couldn't even figure out that she had touched him. She could have continued to walk away and no one would have known. So what is it about this woman that she says, I can't hide this? It's because she knew that Jesus knew she had done it. And he wasn't going to stop until she came forward. In fact, what we're told is when she realizes all that, she comes to him, she's trembling. She's scared to death what's going to happen because she's done this. She falls down, and it's neat because this is the idea of reporting, which is what the man had done and what others were doing when he healed this man, the demoniac. She comes and says that she had touched him, and she tells them how she was healed and tells them why she was there. Now, why would Jesus, if you think about this for just a moment, why would Jesus care that she did this? And here's, I think, the biggest reason why. He wanted to make sure that everyone who knew this woman knew that she was healed. And the only way he was going to do that is to bring her out in the open. He brought a woman who wanted to remain a secret what had happened, and he brings her out publicly. And I don't think it's because he wants the glory from this. Look what he says to the woman. Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace. And this phrasing, except for the word daughter, is almost exactly what Jesus told the woman in chapter 7 that was the sinner. Her faith had saved her. That's the idea. Your faith has saved you. Isn't that really interesting? Here's a woman who comes to him with faith. And the woman here, the response is that she was healed, and she's reporting what God had done. That's the response. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? But it's not over. Again, remember, he's moving. This guy Jairus, he has come to him. He said, my daughter's dying. You got to come. He's still on his way to this guy's house. He has stopped to take care of this woman and to call attention to her when he could have been going all the way to the guy's house to take care of that guy's problem. He stops to demonstrate something about this woman. The very next thing we're told, while he is still talking, somebody from Jairus' house comes out to him and says, the daughter is dead. Trouble not the master. Don't annoy him anymore. Stop annoying Jesus. He's got other things to do. She's dead. He can't help her now. Now, they didn't say this to Jesus. Now, put yourself in his position. What would you be thinking at this point in time? You came out to get him. He's on his way there, and he makes this stop and this demonstration for this woman. And you find out your daughter's dead, so quit annoying the man. Just, let's go bury your daughter. My guess, probably for most of us, what would you think? If you needed something and someone got diverted to help somebody else out, and you really needed their help, you would be thinking, why didn't you go help them? I had that bigger need. I mean, you could have come back and taken care of her. My daughter's dying. Jesus overhears the conversation, and here's what Jesus says. To the credit of Jairus, he says, fear not, and here's where he uses this word, having faith, believe only, and she shall be made whole. She shall be saved. I'll take care of her, but you got to believe. To his credit, what happens? They keep going. Remember, servants have said, stop annoying the man. There's nothing he can do for you now. And Jesus says to him, have faith. And evidently the man had faith. He believed that the sovereign of all the universe could do something. Verse 51 tells us when they get there, he takes only Peter, James, and John, three guys who he likes to take apart with him all the time. Takes these three guys, separates them from the rest of the disciples, takes the father and the mother, and goes inside to see the girl. And sure enough, when he gets there, verse 52 seems to be before this, they had professional wailers. That was their job, to go cry over the fact that you've lost a loved one. Isn't it the interesting job? Your only job was to basically read the obituaries, find out who was dead, and go mourn for them. You didn't have to even know them, just that was your job. That's what they were doing. And when Jesus gets there, he says, weep not, she is not dead, but sleepeth. Now, what would you think of a person who told you that? This guy needs to be committed. We know she's dead. In fact, what's interesting is they don't say we think she's dead. They say we know she's dead. We're guaranteed she's dead. There's everything to say that she's dead. And Jesus has the audacity to say she only sleeps. He takes these people in. They laugh him to scorn. In verse 53, they know she's dead. He puts them all out. He puts his hand, he calls to her and said, rise. Almost like the mother would have said, it's time to wake up now. And the girl, we're told, verse 55, her spirit comes back, she rises straightway, and he commands them to give her meat. And what's interesting is verse 56, Jesus tells the parents not to say anything. Now, you look at those four miracles, isn't it amazing? Jesus has demonstrated that he is the sovereign over the nature, over nature. He is the sovereign over the demons. He is sovereign over physical issues, and he is sovereign over death. Now, how many things don't fit into that in our lives? Well, pretty much nothing. Okay, everything is included in all four of those things. The sovereign of all the universe can take care of any problem any of us have. And what is neat, what I put down here, different ways that he dealt with the miracle. And the first one, it doesn't appear that the disciples told anyone about the problems at sea. They don't go tell anybody over in Gadara. They don't go tell anybody over when they get back. It almost seems like they forget about the story and they don't have time to tell anybody else but themselves what's happened. But the demoniac who was healed, Jesus, he tells him to tell everyone what God had done. So he's supposed to go tell everyone that God has done something on his behalf. The woman with the hemorrhage of blood, she's called in front of others to relate her story. Think about that for a second. So, you got the disciples who probably don't tell anybody. You got the demoniac who's told to tell everybody. Jesus calls the woman in, and she is called to report everything. And Jairus and his wife were told not to tell anyone. So, two people are told, go tell everybody. One group seems to not have the time to tell anybody, and one person has said, don't tell anybody. What does this demonstrate to us about Jesus? Well, I think it demonstrates four things. That he cares for those who are having problems. Jesus seemed to be more concerned about his disciples and their fate. The demoniac and healing him. Jairus' daughter bringing her back to life. And the woman and making her whole. He didn't call any of these people in order to make a spectacle of them. He called them because he cared about what they were doing, what was happening to them. The second thing is that he desires to avoid sensationalism in his miracles. Jesus wasn't looking for a sideshow. How many people do you see today who look for a sideshow? Watch TV. Benny Hinn will hit somebody in the head and they'll fall on the ground and he's healed them. Why does he do that? Why? Because it's sensational. It draws viewers. Jesus doesn't do that. He's not out to get a viewership. He's not out to build this massive army. And folks, by the way, that tells us we can't be building sensationalism into what we're doing just to get people. Jesus didn't, even when he healed them, and we can't. The third thing, that he refuses to use people or events for purely selfish ends. Jesus didn't do any of this so he could get credit for everything that happened. I mean, think about it. He didn't tell the disciples to go tell anybody, and he told these two people, don't go tell anybody. It wasn't like he was doing this so that they would tell anybody. He left the man over in Gadara because that was the only witness he was probably going to have. And he wanted to at least tell them what Jesus was doing. To be able to rejoice in what happened in that man's life. And finally, Jesus leaves people in better shape than when he met them. And so many times we don't. Have you ever gone to a doctor and they left you in worse shape than when you went to them? My guess is every one of us have had those problems, right? Instead of having one problem, now you have 5. And you're going, great. Why did I come to you? Jesus always left people in better position when he left them. In fact, I think this is rather interesting. And if you've ever seen The Robe, there are problems with some of the theology in it in places. But it's interesting because one of the things that the main character says, do you believe he performed all these miracles? And the guy responds back, it doesn't matter if you believe that. The bottom line is, there's never any case where Jesus went out and made a person who could see blind. Where he crippled someone who could walk. And you think about this for a second. In every one of these cases, every one of these people came out better when Jesus had been with them than they were before. Whether it was disciples and what they learned, whether it was all of these different people and the events that happened in their life. And that's true of us. We're better for having known the Lord than we were before. Isn't that wonderful? I left you with this quote down here from Isaac Watts, and we're actually going to sing the song that's on the back. We're going to sing all the verses as Watts wrote them for our closing. I love this thought. He was talking to someone whose sister was sick, and all the problems that we face. I think this is apt to say, a soul is never so near God as when abstracted from and mortified to all this world, where the little pleasing or seizing accidents of daily life scarce move the spirit to joy or anger or sorrow. Their virtue is upon the improving hand. The idea of what he's saying here is this. God does things like he did with all 4 of these people. And why did he do it? You know what, folks? He did it to change those people. The next time we face a storm, we know the one who is in control of it. And you know something? It makes us better people. For having had to trust Him and know that He's the sovereign of the universe. When all nature seems to be against us, our God isn't. When we watch people who have been given over to the devil in so many respects and what they're doing, we can trust the sovereign God of the universe to change their hearts and make them different people. When we have people who are having physical problems, we know that if the Lord wants to, He can change that and He can fix that. Because He's the sovereign of the universe. Nothing is out of His control. And not even death is enough to show us that the sovereign of the universe, He's sovereign even over death. Isn't that an awesome thing to think about? So the question we have to ask ourselves is, do I have faith? Where's my faith? When all these things happen to me, what do I do and how do I act? Do I act in a way that says you're not the sovereign and I can't trust you? Or do we bend our will and say, I'll trust you no matter what happens? That's what the Lord decided to teach these four groups of people. And that's what He desires to teach us. To have faith in our God, because He is the sovereign over everything. Let's pray. Father, we thank You that You are the sovereign of the universe, that all the world will bow the knee before You, that all nature, that all people, and yes, even the devil himself will bow the knee and will have to acknowledge that You are the sovereign of the universe. May You help us to see You and respond in faith. And we truly have faith in the one who deserves it. In Jesus' name, amen.